Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillahi. We wanted to talk about 6 running narratives with regard to the history of Islam in the US and the Americas. And of course, we're not going to be able to do complete justice to this topic because it is a topic which requires much more depth to it. But we have 6 narratives which are operating with regard to the history of Islam in the US and in the Americas overall, but in the US, we want to focus. Firstly, I wanted to say that the way that we characterize the history of Islam in the US is extremely important. The way that we characterize Islam in the US is extremely important. The way that we characterize Islam in the US is extremely important. And the reason why it's important is because, one, we want to be true to the historical realities. 2, it has a great impact on our political existence and influence in this society. 3, it says a lot about our existence in this society, in the US itself. And for a very long time, this was not a problem. It became a problem specifically when there was a move within political circles to marginalize, in specific, the African American community from being spokespeople with regard to the Muslim community. It doesn't mean that others outside of the African American community shouldn't have their due in terms of speaking and representing the Muslim community, but with the marginalization of the African American community from speaking in the name of the Muslim community came a few political moves which we didn't pay attention to. And part of this was strategic on the part of what was going on in the general Muslim community. People wanted more representation from within the Muslim community. And part of it was part of the strategy that was coming from the Islamophobe camp, in my opinion. And there's some data that's there to look at it. Why? Unlike Europe, the Muslim community, the percentage of Muslims that were here that were indigenous to America was overwhelming. And with especially the changes that took place in immigration policy in the 60s, because of the black and brown communities, with the under the leadership of the black community, because of the human social rights struggles that took place along with those whites who were pursuing social justice, or European Americans, I like to say, there was a push to change immigration law. We know that. It's historical fact. We know what took place. And so part of the dilemma that took place in recent times is that with the marginalization of the African American Muslim community, the idea of Islam as being other, not being part of the fabric of American society, it ingrained itself, and that allowed for more and more rhetoric to take place as people invading this country, these Muslims that are coming to invade these other people. It allowed for that racist narrative to continue, and that prejudicial narrative to continue, and that anti-Islamic narrative to continue. Even the way that Islamophobia was characterized within the Muslim community was extremely problematic, because some people decided to characterize Islamophobia and separate the problem of racism from Islamophobia so they won't have to deal with what's going on in the society overall, in the name of uniting the Muslims on some sort of political platform. But that was extremely problematic because it didn't address a lot of different issues that come into play. And so there's a lot of issues that come out of that. And I'll touch on a couple of those issues without a lot of depth. One, that it stops the Muslim community from having a solid dialogue on its political existence and on its participation in this society as citizens, and on the issue of how do we deal with this society, how do we exist. The other thing is, like, for instance, when you look at, just as an example, when the Arab community is characterized as a white community, which many Arabs are opposed to that because it doesn't allow them to particularly benefit from the system on certain levels, that discussion never comes into play when you categorize the Arabs in a certain way, and you never bring up the race issue. And so the Islamophobia issue doesn't want to bring up the intricacies of the race problem in the U.S. And it tries to wipe that out, and it tries to make the problem of Muslims in America solely an issue of religion being accepted, which is more complicated than that, because policy in this country is primarily race-based. And so if you're invisible, what you experience as a community, it's not going to be at the forefront. And so I hope that people can deal with that issue. That's a complex issue. But the issue of Islam being otherized, that comes up when and at a certain point, let's go back a little bit. At a certain point, there was an attempt to completely otherize Islam, and then the African American problem came to the fore, which is, well, you have so many Muslims that have been here generationally, that are African American, that they were born in this country, that it created a problem for those on the right and others to otherize Islam in totality. And the fact that the founding fathers of this country, they had called upon certain aspects of Islam, or even how this country was recognized by Morocco at one point in time during the fight for independence. All of these things complicate the issue, as well as the fact that there were people of African descent, there were Muslim scholars, or there were Muslims that were in this country before certain realities came to the fore. So not characterizing the history of Islam in the U.S. properly, and in the Americas overall, but specifically in the U.S. properly, it contributes to otherizing the Muslim community, and it keeps alive Islamophobia. And what it does is it otherizes the Muslims so that Muslims don't properly participate in the society at the level of full citizens, at the level of full respect. And that's why up to now in many places in this country, although Muslims are a significant portion of the American population, the rights of Muslims, religiously speaking, are not regarded. And so even the whole Islamophobia project has not been able to overcome the lack of recognition of Muslims to have their rights to be acknowledged. And the Muslims have remained in a minority status with regard to having their rights recognized, such as the ability of Muslims to get off for their religious holidays, and for Muslim youth to be acknowledged in the school system, the same way that Jewish youth are recognized in the school system, and there's a catering to them with regard to kosher food, or catering to them with regard to the holidays realized, or the same thing when it comes to the issue as teaching how society should respect the Jewish community. When we come to the issue of the Muslims, sometimes what we see in the curriculum is a curriculum which has been a part of the problem. So Muslims are characterized in such a way that they're characterized as others in the school curriculum. And even every year when we deal with the issue of 9/11, we don't deal with it properly. And the youth, many youth have reported this issue, including my own daughter, feeling otherized, like she's the one that was responsible for what took place in 9/11. So otherizing the Muslim community is part of the problem that results from not properly characterizing the history of Islam in America. And what it does is it doesn't allow us to understand the long history that this country has with Muslims going back, centuries. It's not just something that just occurred in this century, but when we look at the Muslims, how they came into the Americas and how they came into the Americas, what not properly characterizing the history of Muslims in the Americas does is it severs ourselves from that history and that origin, and that also creates a problem within the history of people of African descent. It severs the relationship of people of African descent that acknowledge their relationship to Islam from that trajectory, that, you know, ancient trajectory, which we're going back almost like about 500 years or more at this point, or a little over 500 years. So we have a characterization that the history of Islam began with the immigrants, and in some cities that's very prominent and dominant. And here we're talking about predominantly the Arab and the Desi community. And so even the acknowledgement of the history of Islam going way back, you know, going way back beyond the 80s and the 90s and so on and so forth. What we begin to see is that there's a negation of the role of Eastern European Muslims. And Eastern European Muslims were in the Midwest, and they had established masajid or mosques that ended up going into decline and eventually disappearing. And some were recovered and regrouped. And so even that history of the relationship of Muslims to this country and the issue of the migration from the Ottoman Empire to here becomes negated. It's something that's not clear to many Muslims. And so even when it comes to the immigrants that were coming from Europe or the Middle East or even from Asia, Southeast Asia, that history is properly not dealt with. So what happens is that it's either that we're dealing with convert Muslims that came from the African American community, and then people is a shaky way that we characterize that history, or we're dealing with immigrants that came here, you know, in the 80s and in some in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and then that history is not characterized properly because, like we said, there were people that migrated here from Eastern Europe, and some people that migrated from Southeast Asia, and some that migrated from the Arab world earlier on, but you know, their presence was not dominant. And so you know, under certain criteria, I guess, of analysis, the issue of numerical significance or the issue of percentages makes things relevant or irrelevant. But the fact is, historical realities dictate that there were people that were here. So even the way that the history of Islam in America with regard, or the U.S. specifically with regard to immigration from the Muslim world, how that's characterized is not characterized correctly. But some talk about the origin of Islam in America being with the late phase of immigration. And what that does is that they end up wiping out the history of other people that have migrated here, and the African American community, Muslim community, and the Latino community as well. Because sometimes even when we talk about the history of Islam in America, we're talking about the history of Islam in America from the lens of the African American community. And what ends up being the case is that the history of the Latino Muslim community is wiped out along with that. Whereas we have the case, like for instance, when we talk about the lineage of Dus Muhammad and Hisham Jabir specifically, and during that time period as well, but that lineage specifically incorporates the Latino community. And so out of the Hisham Jabir and his existence as a community leader and the community under him, the Latino community came. So the Latino community has been in existence maybe about 50, 60 years in some odd fashion or another, or some mature fashion, and that history gets wiped out. And so that by not properly characterizing that history as well, you know, what ends up happening is that the history of Islam begins to look like it only begins with either the immigrants or the Nation of Islam, right? And so those are problems. Those are problems in the way that the history of Islam in the U.S. is formulated and done, because the history of Islam in America is neither solely with the immigrant community that comes in the late phase of immigration, which will put us into mostly the 80s and the 90s and some in the 70s, smatterings in the 60s, late 60s, but mostly in the 70s and 80s, where immigration policy now is kicking in. We're left with that being the history of Islam, the origin of history of Islam in America, or we're left with the history of Islam in America being the Nation of Islam. And so that is not completely accurate. You understand what I'm saying? And so that becomes an issue when people talk about Islam in America. And we have some people in the African American community and the immigrant community that they negate the history of Islam before, and they talk about it being in the post-Malcolm phase. when it comes to the African American community. And that's thanks to some brothers in the African American community that they contributed to that problem. And many of the immigrants contributed to that issue of the way that they understand the Malcolm reality. And so then we also have what happens in academia, that the history of Islam, the origin of it begins with what they call pseudo-Islam movements and Noble Drew Ali Ahmadiyya, and they also put under that the Nation of Islam. And so then the origins of the history of Islam in America become very vague on multiple fronts, and that serves a political purpose. Also, one of the oddities of Muslims in America is that we never get an accurate count of who is Muslim in America, or we never get an approximate figure which will shift the political realities. And that's why the othering of the Muslim community is important for certain political interests, either against the Muslims or for the Muslims. When we other the Muslim community and those who are against Islam, they benefit from that, because what it does is it decreases the number of Muslims in the U.S. And what it does is it makes the Muslims look like outsiders. What it does as a problem for those that are interested in the political action of the Muslim community when that issue is not dealt with properly is that you never have an accurate count when the Muslims are othered, right? When the Muslims are other, or when the Muslims are only considered to be the immigrant community that came in the late 80s and 90s and so on and so forth. This is a real problem on many fronts. One, that on the political level, it creates a dilemma for us. The other is that it allows prejudice and racism and discrimination to continue on multiple levels across the board, across the different ethnicities. I just heard a story today of a Muslim sister, a Latina Muslim sister, who was applying for certain jobs. And her interview process was going really well until she had to do an in-person interview. And when she came in with the hijab, she has a Latina Muslim, a Latina non-Muslim, so to speak, name, or just a Latina name that won't identify her with Islam, better said. But when she came in, it became an issue for the interviewers and the job itself. And she felt as though it was an issue of discrimination, not against her being Latina, but against her being a Muslim. And so we find that, racism and discrimination and prejudice, it continues to exist because of the way that we deal with things on multiple levels. So the prejudice here and the discrimination is based on religion. You understand what I'm saying? Where in other cases, it may be based on national origin, language, and this, that. So that's a complicated issue. We can't deal with those issues properly because of the way that we are continuing to deal with the history of Islam in the U.S. and the way that we allow the othering of Muslims to exist, and the way Islamophobia is characterized, to be honest with you. Islamophobia has been characterized to be just an immigrant reality many times, and it doesn't take into consideration what happens in the African American community, what happens in the Latino community, what happens in the European American community, or even what happens with Muslims that are Asian, non-Southeast origin. And there's others as well that take the brunt, like the Eastern European Muslims. They take the brunt on many fronts, because on many fronts they are considered to be white, so they don't suffer, the issue of whiteness in the same way. They don't suffer the issue of non-whiteness in the same way, but then they suffer issues of discrimination for being Muslim and not fitting in. It's a problematic issue across the board. So, also what it does is it creates an identity crisis amongst the youth and amongst the Muslims themselves. And it creates especially a political consciousness crisis amongst Muslims. Because what happens is that the Muslims still consider themselves outsiders. And they don't know how to consider themselves as being part of the society and exercising their rights in the society properly. They consider themselves as an immigrant group having to exercise their rights in that capacity, but they don't realize that the history of Islam in this country has deeper roots, and those roots go way back. And so we're on a continuum of exercising, the manifestation of Muslims as being part of the history of this country, whether some like it or not, or history of these lands, whether some like it or not. And so these are serious dilemmas on multiple fronts. The dilemmas are psychological dilemmas, political dilemmas, historical dilemmas, right? And identity issues, which you can say it overlaps with the psychological and other, but is also a legal issue and is also a cultural issue, right? And so until we begin to address this on a proper front, we will always have a problem. We have all these debates that take place. May Allah bless Imam Talib Abdul Rashid from MIB, that he has addressed the problem of just only looking at the origin of Islam, specifically within the African American or black community, to begin with the Nation of Islam. And there's Akil Fahad, brother Akil Fahad, as a community historian, has always made sure that people have an understanding that the origin of Islam is not only with the nation, but that there were others. And we have problem issues, like, for instance, the way that people came out of the Ahmadiyya movement. We have Wali Akram, who came into Islam in the 1930s, who didn't have the origin of his coming into Islam being with the Nation of Islam. But he had a different origin. That's not properly understood. And so there's this competition sometimes that takes place. Well, I didn't come into the nation. I came in through another route, or I came in with the sound aqidah. All that type of approach, that doesn't help anything for doing solid history work. And it doesn't do anything for helping us work out identity issues. And neither does it do anything for us of understanding the positive contributions that have come forward of non-Islamic origins or pseudo-Islamic origins or associated with Islam in a distorted way origin. We haven't understood that phenomenon. And this is the same issue that we talked about, some years back with regard to many people coming into Islam by way of hip-hop or popular culture, especially in the way later post-Malcolm phase. We're talking about the late 80s and the 90s. And so that has been rejected by some Muslim Maulanas and others, and they have negated the history. And in negating the history, like, there were some Maulanas in the Chicagoland area that tried to negate the history, and they were teaching that to some people, that, oh no, that's not true, that the origin of Islam didn't come through the hip-hop music for some people, and so on and so forth. And those are problems. Those are problems in the way that people characterize issues, and the lack of understanding the way social change and da'wah works, and the way that ideas impact, and the way of influence works, and so on and so forth. Because that necessitates a deeper analysis, which is more systematic, more sociological, more anthropological. And most people don't have that type of background, or neither has the time been invested to look at those issues in that way, the Islamic phenomena and how it manifests itself in one way or another, and how it is that Islam asserts itself in different ways in the imagination, of the general landscape in American society. That type of discourse, or that type of analysis, or that type of looking at things or reading things, is beyond where most people are at. So they take the easy route of just writing this off and that off. And so part of the issue that we have, it is doing the proper work that needs to be done in order to understand things systematically. We can't be, lazy in this front, and dealing with ideas in a very serious and careful manner, and respectful manner to the topic and to concepts and to ideas and to principles and to peoples. We don't do that type of work. Can you imagine if we're not talking to each other in a respectful way when it takes a topic like this to be treated? How are we going to deal with it in our own circles? And so, unfortunately, a lot of this work is done by academics, is done in academia, and is treated in different ways. There's a book about this thick just on the history of Islam in Newark. And alhamdulillah, that was done, I believe, by a Muslim brother, but it was published within the academic circles because we as Muslims don't want to unpack that history. There's a lot of emotions, there's a lot of concepts, a lot of ideas that come into play, a lot of bad feelings. And so a lot of times when it comes to the issue of being able to work through these ideas, we don't. Today, a journalist contacted me about her digging up of the history of the Latino Muslim community in Newark, and tracing the origins of some communities here in North Jersey, and their attachment to the Nation of Islam, and how they evolved into other things, and so on and so forth. And she was talking about the complexity of really working out their history because of where people are at psychologically and in their understanding. And that conversation that she had with me came in the midst of conversing with brothers over the same problem of how do you deal with the Malcolm phenomenon, El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. Did he create the Nation of Islam in part? Not in total, but in part. Did he evolve it as an institution and an organization and end up outgrowing it or not? So if he did, do we consider part of that legacy as our legacy as Muslims here in the U.S.? I consider that to be the reality. You understand what I'm saying? That's the work that Malcolm put in. And there we know for a fact that there was people that were studying Islam within the nation. We know that even in Chicago, there were Sunnis that were teaching people in the nation. And we know that that interaction has existed. And so that's a complicated phenomenon that just can't be written off based on people's emotions or their analysis or their analytical categories. You understand what I'm saying? Because that creates a block for us. I'm of the school of Imam Ibn Khaldun. I'm of the school of looking at anthropological issues, political issues, looking at intellectual, philosophical issues, institutional issues, geographical issues, historical issues. If we don't have that multi-tiered way of analysis or analyzing, or don't have multi-layered analyses that work together, then it's impossible for us to properly understand things at a mature level with the due care and diligence that's necessary. And that's one phenomenon amongst others. If we were able to understand these things at a higher level, then we can maybe go deeper to understand the influences of conversion, or how it is that people convert. And it's sad because a person like Richard Bulliet, who is part of Columbia University in New York, he did a study of conversion, and it's a study that's heavy in the Muslim world. And he talked about how people converted. You understand what I'm saying? That's another issue. Ahmed Mubarak brings this issue up. The whole concept of the Hanafi movement. The Hanafi movement as being a movement that existed in the community and it existed in the prison system, and how that had an impact. There's so much to be studied overall that it's impossible for us to be able to accurately do this unless we're meticulous and unless we're even-tempered emotionally, and unless we come at this in a systematic, methodological, scientific manner. There's no way, because there's so many different layers to the reality. When I was in Chicagoland, I was told about one brother from India who existed, and he was there earlier on at a very early phase before much of the Desi community, and how he interacted with different communities and how he interrelated. There's so many phases to this to properly understand. Just even the origin of Hamtramck. Hamtramck now is being a Sunni Muslim community. When we go back, how that was a base for Elijah Muhammad, and how Detroit itself was a base for Islam for many years. Even things like the relationship between St. Louis, and how St. Louis's origins go back to Islam in different ways, and different things like even the whole concept of groups like the Rukn and others, like these types of analyzing these things at multiple levels, the intersection between popular street culture and institutions and figures and policies and all of that. We don't have that level of analysis. You understand what I'm saying? In a systematic way. Some people have worked through this stuff alone, but piecing the things together, we don't have it. But in any event, the othering of the Muslim community is the end result of not properly understanding the origin of the Muslim community, or the origins, properly said, in the Muslim landscape here in the U.S. and in the Americas overall. Many people don't know the deep ties that Islam from West Africa has to the Caribbean, to Cuba, to Puerto Rico, to the Dominican Republic, and to places like Brazil and others. You understand that how many scholars were from Timbuktu, they were in those regions. Haiti, that's a big problem overall. Even Colombia, all types of places, when we look historically, even in those communities, there's this way of doing history. I have a book that talks about the Muslims in Brazil, and it tries to do some of that history, and it does it scantily. You know what I'm saying? But in Brazil, there's no denial of the history of Islam going way back, and they have Muslim communities there. You can't necessarily deny it in the same way that you deny it in other places. And so with that, we end. Inshallah, Ahmed, we need to talk. And so we, at some point, these things need to be clarified better, but our frame of analysis is very weak. it doesn't is not inclusive enough to be able to incorporate multiple themes and trajectories of thought. And a lot of times we're arguing based on certain things that don't allow us to really have mature discussions because the frame is not proper. The frame of analyses is not proper. And so even this whole idea, unfortunately, has emerged among some of the indigenous and unfortunately some of the African American communities to negate Islam, post the Hajj of, before the Hajj of Malcolm. That's an extremely problematic understanding that people have overall. It just is, and so with that we end, just the proof of before going, I just wanted to say that when we look at Elijah Muhammad's sons, how Elijah Muhammad had a son that was studying in Al-Azhar, Akbar Muhammad. How do you deal with that phenomena? How do you deal with the phenomena that there were people that were studying Islam, and how do you deal with that? And having to learn how to work with that reality of an organization which is closed, and that was part of the challenge of Malcolm. You understand? That was part of the challenge of Malcolm. And how do you instigate change or bring about change without disruption and violence in an organization, or people that believe certain things and you're challenging their belief, and you talk about change. Change is very difficult to achieve. And how do you achieve that? The Prophet ﷺ himself, he had to instigate change in a way, that was healthy, and he attempted as much as possible, but the opposition came from outside. And so we see that reality even in the Muslim community, right? Even in the Muslim community. So we have an issue, right? So at the end of the day, the conversation moves forward. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you to all that participated. Jazakumullah khairan, Ahmed. Yes. And Imam Ahmed Burhani, I had a journalist who is looking to talk to you. She has a Puerto Rican sister who's Muslim from Newark. And she was just calling me this morning and she mentioned your name, that she wanted to talk to you. They're looking to do a documentary. And so she has a lot of data that she had collected, but it's difficult because she's coming from the Latina Muslima angle. And so some people did not accept, they're not accepting the fact that she's coming from that angle, but she had mentioned your name, on the issue of talking about North Jersey and the history of Islam in North Jersey, and it's tied to the nation of Islam. Newark, specifically, in my opinion, has not been done the justice. We talk about New York, we talk about Philly. But alhamdulillah, that's documented for many people, and we have people like you that are oral historians, so to speak. But that has to come out. I don't think that we can understand dawah properly, or even how to service our people, or even how to take the goodness from our people and their history if we don't want to acknowledge these things in the right light. And me personally, I negate anyone who constantly is bringing negativity about the Black African American community, especially in Islam. We have this phenomena that everything, and I'll say, and I know it's controversial, but we have this phenomena that everything Salafi is right and everything else is wrong. And so what it does is it makes the Black community looks like it doesn't have any contribution to the deen whatsoever. And like the civilization effect in terms of what religion properly means only came from the late Najdi, Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabian phenomena. And if anything is to the detriment, we have to be careful of how we deal with that. There was some good, but there was a lot of social damage. There was a lot of collapsing of institutions in the Black community specifically because of the way that was handled. And that was the same thing that occurred in different phases. What the entry of Tablighi Jamaat and the role of Tabligh in the African American community, how that led to a lot of tensions. And I have the receipts for that. When you look at places like Ohio, which I was there for a long time, that created a detriment when it came to the community of Wali Akram. And Wali Akram came into Islam and was a contemporary of Elijah Muhammad. And Elijah Muhammad sat along with other leaders in the Muslim community together. They all were together, talking and dialoguing about the future of Islam. And that was an interesting point, but just those tensions that come when we begin to learn new things, whether it's Salah in a new way, or whether it's a point in Aqidah, how we fail to be able to have continuity within our community, that's an issue. And yes, the Qadiani problem is a major issue because of the Qadiani movement itself within the Muslim world. Maududi had made takfir of the Qadiani movement before many, Maulana Maududi. And so then at the other side of the spectrum, and that's what I was talking about earlier about the phenomena of conversion, it becomes a conundrum. It becomes something which causes us to speculate on the mysterious nature of how it is that Allah guides. Yani walau bi rajulin fajir. And so even, at the hand of a person that is a wrongdoer. And so the Qadiani movement, we know that, that created a massive impact. And it created a way for people to come to rediscover Islam, because we know that many Africans were of Islamic origin in their religion and so on and so forth. But that phenomena of how the Qadianism paved the way for people to come to understand Islam. Many of us that we want to only talk about Aqidah and sound Aqidah only as being that, we don't talk about how it is that people, came into some sort of sound Aqidah, or people came into a better understanding, or they may have discovered the sound Aqidah within those movements just by the way that they reflected or how literature was presented, but they never maybe they never announced it. And so the way that we understand this phenomena, I'm not of Islam in America or the U.S. specifically, I personally am not convinced that we're doing it in an honest, just, equitable way, and we really need to have some solid dialogues. Just like I make the argument, Malcolm was a mujaddid. He was a reviver of the deen, and there's many receipts that we can pull out in that regard. And so Malcolm, even in his process, and I argue, and I still argue, and I think up to now, I'm convinced of it. Can I change my opinion? Yes. But I'm convinced, and I think the receipts are on my side, that Malcolm significantly built the nation. And so the heritage of the nation, especially what Malcolm contributed to it, in terms of his expanding of temples, in terms of his development of recruits and his contribution to the FOI and other, that did create problems even within the nation amongst other ministers and so on and so forth. But how can we negate that contribution? You understand what I'm saying? In terms of Malcolm to the reality of the U.S. And how can we call upon the Malcolm conversion process and not acknowledge that and say, well, it was only until after Hajj? When many of us have gone through that, reality. You understand what I'm saying? That reality of transformation, but we have not gotten to that point. Malcolm for us was a model of transformation. And I'll be straight up and honest that what has come as far as conversion in the late after Malcolm phase has been a disaster. The issue of people, many imams came into Islam and they were looking at that model of Malcolm and they realized that they couldn't just speak anyway to the community, that they had to be productive, that they couldn't keep the same negative habits. That's what we gained. But we have destroyed that in the name of, we have sound Aqidah, but then we speak to the Muslim community and to each other in the most dehumanizing manners and forms. So what sound Aqidah do we actually have? Anyone can go to a book and recite what's in the book. The sound Aqidah is what we carry in our hearts and in our behavior. The sound Aqidah manifests itself in our deeds and in the way that we treat each other. But I don't want to get preachy on that point, other than to say that, I think that we need to revisit things. And I think that the more that we do that properly, we also open up the door and the platform for other people to be interested in the reality of the Quran and the Sunnah in ways that they maybe have not accessed. Because we're not going to negate that people are accessing Islamic truth. But there's aspects of Islamic truth, or there's aspects of the truths of Islam that are not being accessed by people because of us, the way that we block the door for people. And so we would do well if we had 50 brothers, 10 brothers from the nation of Islam that are solid to come in to our community, right? And so that's something that is important to understand. You know what I'm saying? And so we would do well. And so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he prayed for the two Umars to come in. He prayed for Umar to come in out of the orientation of Umar because of the qualities that he had. Sulaim, she married Talha, and she didn't refuse Talha because of the qualities that he had. And Talha, his coming into Islam has something, you know what I'm saying, that it has something to do with the issue of what? Of looking for the qualities and the characteristics of people, you know. So we like to neglect, especially when it comes to blackness and the achievements of blackness. We, in our community, in the black and brown community, we have that problem. And I say it's the problem of self-hate. And we continue that trajectory, and we talk about prejudice and racism of other people, but we ourselves perpetuate that in our own communities. You know, and that's a dilemma that we have, unfortunately. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.